my name is Jack Hopkins. I work for the state of West Virginia with the Watershed Assessment Branch. So Tommy works for the for WIB, and I work for WAB. And so my branch does the assessment part of wetlands, and she does more of the outreach side and getting people involved. All right, so I've been with DEP now for almost 3 years. I have a bachelor from Marshall University in biology and a master's in environmental science from Virginia Commonwealth University from Richmond. But I came back here, followed a girl, and now I'm here in West Virginia. So to get started, I thought I'd do a little pop quiz on the first slide. Does anybody remember what this frog is? Can I see the chat? Whoa. This is sorry, I can't see the chat for some reason, but this is the northern leopard frog. So if you got that little pat on the back, there are going to be some more frogs throughout. So hopefully you remember your frogs from yesterday if you attended yesterday. All right, so I'm going to hit this real quick. I know Tommy hit this a lot yesterday, but this is super, super important and something that you should really come out of this class with. How wetlands work, right? And why they're so important. If anything you come out with, you say wetland, you'll say kidneys of the environment or the landscape, right? All right, so it'll take in water, it'll dissipate that stream energy, slow it down, and you'll have, because it slows it down, you'll have things that filter out because of the plants, as well as now it's slower and things are just dropping out of the water. And so you have cleaner outflow of water. We also have bacteria that are naturally forming in these wetland environments that will break down nutrients. And overall, wetlands in general, most wetlands are carbon sinks, which means that they're taking in and they're storing carbon. So in the future, if we're monitoring climate change, we should be really monitoring our wetlands to see how much carbon is actually staying in these wetlands for our future. All right. So that's all. I know she went over that. I just really want to hammer this. They're so important, reducing flooding and everything I just said. All right, so here is an elevation map of West Virginia. All right, so we've got our light blues along the Ohio River here and in Jefferson County. These are the lowest parts of our state. We've also got these whites to purplish reds, which is going to be the highest parts of our state. All right, so when you're looking at this, I want you to imagine where you think wetlands are going to be across this landscape. All right. Everybody got that in their mind? Across this landscape, we have a ton of alluvial wetlands and vernal pools statewide, but we have a lot of main wetland complexes that are going to be along the Ohio River, probably where you thought, right? Because it's a river, it's going to flood the banks, more water is going to be there. But we also have our main wetland complexes in these high Allegheny wetlands, like your Dolly Sods, Canaan Valley, Cranesville, Cranberry Glades, and the Meadow River wetlands, which are is a huge wetland complex. If you've ever driven down 64, you've been past this wetland before. We also have our marl marshes in Jefferson County, so you might have guessed that place because it's lower. And we also have what are called summit sinkholes, which aren't very big wetland complexes, but they're super unique to our area, so they're important. So those are just big wetland complexes and general areas that you would find wetlands. but wetlands are actually statewide. Okay, so you'll be able to find this in your backyard. You don't have to go to one of these places to find a wetland, but these are where we're going to have big clusters of wetlands. All right, so I mentioned wetlands are statewide. This is our NWI, or the National Wetlands Inventory. And this mapping is done in about the 1890s. So it's a pretty outdated mapping right now. All right, 1980s, I said 1890s, 1980s. So it's a little outdated, but it is our best available mapping. We've recently got some updates to this, so things will have changed from this, but in general, this is our best mapping for the state. And you can kind of see what I'm talking about with the last slide, right? We've got main wetland complexes in green in the middle here in Grant and Tucker County, as well as along the Ohio River. Those are kind of your more standout areas. If you were to zoom in though, you'd be able to see little tiny dots, and each little tiny dot is a wetland. So right now we've got about 66,000 acres mapped across the state, which if you're looking at the state, that's not a lot of land, right? That's about 1%, if not less than 1% of the entire landscape, right? In the past, we probably had closer to an estimated 100 to 150,000 acres, and which have recently been lost. But in history, throughout history, there's an estimated 500,000 acres that have been lost. So our numbers are going down, and we are aware of that, and that's why we're monitoring and making sure that we do everything to keep these important resources. All right, so as I mentioned, there's 1% of the landscape that's wetland, and it actually holds a lot of our biodiversity in these wetlands, which is why they're very important. So I want to, before I can talk about biodiversity, you need to know kind of the history of our landscape here. And so West Virginia, if you can see this map of the US about 18,000 years ago, we've got this mid-taiga to dry tundra, open boreal woodland, all kind of in this one little area. And above us, there's this big glacial ice sheet. And so what's super important to take away from this is that, one, our location is below the south of the maximum grade extent of glaciation. So we're not covered in ice at this point. Two, what I just mentioned, right? We've got a compression of these climatic zones and habitats in this mountainous region. We've got multiple things, multiple animals, multiple fauna and flora in this one area, okay? And two, which I'll mention here in a second, if we're looking at all of the US, or not all of the US, all of the right northeast of the US, we have the highest percentage of globally rare species in the Northeast, right? So because of what I just mentioned, right, we've got all these climatic zones leading to multiple species here. When everything recedes, the ice goes back. Some species will stay in our higher elevations, while what used to be in the south will come north. And so now we've got a mix in West Virginia of both these northern species that you would typically find now in Canada. We have some of those, but what used to be in the south has now come here. And so now we've got a mix between these, what you find in Canada now and what you find normally here, right? So we've got everything combining in one perfect storm to form this great concentration of globally rare species, right? So when you're looking at West Virginia, just know you're in a special place. We also have the Appalachian Mountains, right? which has some of the highest connectivity when you're comparing the landscape today, right? So it's got a higher connectivity of forests and mountain ranges that will hopefully and have allowed for this higher diversity. All right. So why are wetlands important, right? They're only 1%. We've been told they have a lot of important rare species. Well, I'm not sure you realize how many rare species we have. So in wetlands, they're so diverse that they have 23% of West Virginia's total flora, right? And of that, 44 of the flora, 44% of West Virginia's rare flora, right? So we've got 23% of the total flora, 44% rare flora, right? So when you're looking at this map here, right, that's like if you're just dropping randomly rare species, you're putting 44% into 1% of the entire area of West Virginia. So really small, but really critical portion. All right, and throughout history, we haven't really taken care of our wetlands. And so I'm gonna kind of go through a brief little history on where we started to where we are now, right? So in the past, and especially in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1940s, there was a really big push for agriculture, right? And so one way to get more space for agriculture is to use the flat lands. Flat lands are typically where you're going to find wetlands, unfortunately. And if you were to drain a wetland, it actually produces very rich and fertile soil. So in the 1700s, 1800s, people would take advantage of this. They would drain tile wetlands to clear them out for farming and agricultural purposes. Because of this, just to make way for various agricultural practices, the last bison was shot in a wetland, so it was hunted and cleared. And the last elk was hunted in the same wetland and was cleared. I know they've recently had an introduction of elk not too long ago, which is good to know, but in the past, this is where these animals were killed. And the beavers, fishers, river otters were all extirpated in about the 1980s. So there's a lot of hunting and there's a lot of agricultural practices going on. Another way we're getting rid of wetlands is from floodplain development, right? So a lot of wetlands are formed when a stream overflows its bank. It's now outside of its bank and it's sitting in this land beside the stream, right? It's just going to hold, the water is going to hold onto these lands, and it will form a nice little wetland there. One way we get rid of that is just floodplain development, and that's happening. We'll see that all throughout the coast, which isn't West Virginia, but we also have done this along our streams. General development, like your Walmarts, Targets, stores like that, we do have wetlands that are not associated with streams or are ways away from streams, and sometimes these get developed over. Another way is through extractive industries like mining, valley fill, and acid mine drainage. I should say mine, not mined. So these areas, they impact our wetlands through water quality impacts, as well as our stream impacts. They mountaintop removal and valley fill, they all degrade habitat and reduce our total biodiversity for these wetlands. There are also some unintended impacts from all of these, right? And one of those unintended impacts is invasive species, right? And this is a real problem that we have, especially today, from things that are really unintended, right? You're putting in a Walmart, fine, next to a wetland, not even on top of the wetland. You put a Walmart in, but maybe there's a seed that gets caught on your boot. You walk next to the wetland, it's now in the wetland. And then it just starts to take over, right? These invasive species, they are really tricky to deal with because of a lot of various reasons, but typically there are 4 main reasons. 1, they have self-fertilization. 2, they have like lower tissue construction costs, so it's easier for them to grow. 3, they have higher leaf area, so they're taking in more sun, making it easier to grow. And they have some phenotypic plasticity, and what that means is they're able to change with their environment. So like one good way, one good example is a cattail, right? Cattails are in fluctuating water levels, which might drown out other vegetation, but they are adapted to these fluctuating water tables. And so you'll typically find cattails in places where the water table changes rapidly. One other thing, which is kind of a looming over everything and a wrench in the whole system, is climate change. This would just mean more of the extremes in weather. So whether that's floods or droughts or just general warming. Droughts are pretty obvious. If you take away the water, you're not going to have a wetland. Flooding is maybe less obvious because, right, more water, but if you're consistently flooding something, you're leading to higher invasive species, or if you're consistently flooding an area, then it's no longer a wetland and it's either a pond or like a stream or lake or something like that. All right, so we've talked a lot about how to destroy wetlands and how things were, right? Okay. So, right, in the past, right, it was drain it, dredge it, mine it, or fill it. You can cut off its water supply, or you can flood it. You can remove its vegetation buffer, which restricts biodiversity of a wetland. And also, you can pollute its waters, or you can allow invasive species to take over. The one thing you maybe should be on the lookout when you're visiting a naturalized area are these invasive species. So I've got a little quiz, I guess, for you next year. See if you know your invasive species. All right, so these are the lineup, the main invasive species that we have in West Virginia. All right, does anybody know this first one? In the top right, I should say. Top left, sorry, top left. This one that I'm hovering over. All right, well, I can't see the chat, so I'm just gonna go ahead. But if you said the Japanese honeysuckle, then pat yourself on the back. The next one to the left, or I mean right, this one here is everywhere. You probably have seen it. If you haven't, then you haven't been outside. You've definitely seen this one, and you just might not have known it. This one is the Japanese knotweed. If you really look at this picture, walk outside, find a stream, I guarantee you're gonna find this Japanese knotweed somewhere along that stream. It's really one of the things about botany is that if you don't know it, everything looks green and everything looks great. If you do know it, you start to see some of the negative side effects to what's in the landscape. But this Japanese knotweed is everywhere, and you will have definitely seen this one. The next one is the Asiatic tear thumb on the top right there. This next one, starting from the left in the middle, is the purple loosestrife. This is very pretty, but super invasive as well. This middle one, or this middle left, is one you probably dealt with as well, and those who have walked through it will know how it feels. This is the multiflora rose. This one will stick with you and will pierce your jackets or your skin. This one hurts. I've walked through this many times. This next one I think needs no introduction. Everybody probably knows this one. These are cattails. We in West Virginia, we say all cattails are invasive. There are actually native cattails to America. They were typically on the coast, but they hybridize super easily. And so all of the cattails now in West Virginia have either hybridized in some form or fashion. So every cattail that we see here in West Virginia is invasive. But there were native cattails, but not the ones we have today. This next one is the pale yellow iris. This one looks super pretty, but also super invasive and spreads very quickly. The next one you've probably seen as well. You might have overlooked it. This one is reed canary grass. The one middle on the bottom is also something that you'll probably find in your driveway, or it can be in taking over a wetland. And it is small carpet grass. Same thing with this bottom right picture. You've probably seen it. It's super characteristic. It has almost like a plastic looking line down the middle. I don't know if you can see from that picture, but you've seen this one as well probably, and it is the Japanese stilt grass. All right, so now out of this lineup, can you pick out the most invasive species in West Virginia? I'll give you a second to peruse them. All right, the most invasive species, drum roll please, is reed canary grass. This one will take over an entire wetland within a season and cut off everything. This is super invasive, something that we're trying really hard to combat, and pretty unsuccessfully really, but this one is super invasive. So keep out on a lookout for this. If you're in a wetland that has this and you're walking through, please make sure, or any of these really, please make sure that you decontaminate your boots, either through washing, or we use a 10% bleach solution on our shoes and stuff. So 10% bleach, 90% water, spray it on there, leave it on for five minutes, and that should take care of it. But we highly recommend that, just so we're not spreading these invasive species. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about, those are kind of how things have been in the past. Let's talk about what kind of regulations we have. So with any regulations, there has to be some sort of interest in these places, and it really all kind of started from waterfowl and birds. So people wanted to hunt these things like Ducks Unlimited. These conservation agencies really loved birds and found that wetlands hold a lot of birds, whether that's waterfowl, songbirds, just a whole host of various species, right? And so there's really an interest in these locations because of birds initially. Some of the birds that you might be familiar with and have seen these pretty commonly. I'll start on the top left here, is the willow flycatcher. That's in the top left. In the bottom left is the swamp sparrow. In the top middle is the common yellowthroat. This one's abundant in wetlands and pretty easy to find, and also very bright. The bird on the right probably needs no introduction either. This is the great blue heron and is often found in wetlands and is one of the easier ones to spot. But we've got about 96 different birds that breed specifically in wetlands, 13 of which are wetland dependent and 13 of which are rare. And we even have high elevation wetland birds. Specifically, we have 6 that are restricted to high elevations, and 4 of those are actually rare birds now. So there's still a lot of interest in them with how rare these birds are, but that's initially where things started. And these are some common ones that you'll find. Maybe some uncommon ones, the rarer birds that you might keep a special lookout for. And some of you might have seen these. It's not impossible. They are there. This starting in the top left is the alder flycatcher. Top middle is the olive-sided flycatcher. He's got a little jacket. I don't know if you can kind of tell from that. He's got a little jacket coming in on both sides here. The top right is the northern water thrush. This looks like the Louisiana water thrush, but they are different, but they also like wetlands as well. The bottom left is Wilson's snipe. Kind of looks like a woodcock in a way, but this is the Wilson snipe. A sedge wren is in the middle on the bottom, and then an owl, which is the saw-whet owl, which I'll get to that guy in a bit. All right, so those are some rarer birds that you might see and what really started the interest in some of these, as well as I didn't mention waterfowl, but everybody likes, or initially they like to hunt waterfowl, and there was a huge push to conserve these places because of waterfowl. Now it is more about, it's all inclusive, right? So it's still about birds, but now it includes insects, it includes bears, it includes especially our flora for this area, because now we know how diverse it is and how rare things are in these places. All right. So what kind of legal protection do we have for these places, right? So the first one is not specific to wetlands, right? It's about birds. It's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This is an international treaty that includes the US, Canada, and Mexico, as well as some others, that ensures the sustainability of populations throughout. So you can't hunt these species, you can't destroy nests of these species. But that's not specific to wetlands, but these birds are found in wetlands, so it kind of protects a wetland if you find it. But these are temporary securities, I should say. So if you're trying to put in, let's say, a road, right, and you want to go through a wetland, but you find one of these birds, you have to stop, right? Or you can't build in that location, right? So this is a temporary, and as soon as that bird leaves, isn't found there for a while, then you can now go through that wetland. So this is not a wetland protection. This is for birds found in a wetland, potentially. Another way, which is again not specific to wetlands, is through the Endangered Species Act, right? I mentioned how many rare species are in wetlands. So this is in a way protecting wetlands, but this prevents the take or destruction of habitat for specific endangered species, as well as sets up various entities that will preserve different species. But again, not wetland specific, but there are a lot of rare species in wetlands, so this can get called upon at times. And we like to use every tool that we can to help preserve these places. All right, so the next one, which is wetland specific, hopefully I can pull that up. Yes, all right. So we've got the Food Security Act, which I'll talk about first, which is a federal law and has to deal with farming. So our soil scientists, this is run by them. This is called the Swamp Buster provision, and it prevents farmers from filling or destroying wetlands because it will restrict or you will lose subsidies from the government for farming. So if you destroy a wetland, you'll lose your government funding. But this will allows people to continue to farm and drain wetlands if there was an impact prior to 1985. So not perfect and not inclusive of all wetlands. This is specifically for farming, right? So a little bit better, more specific to wetlands, but not all wetlands. Our main tool to help prevent destruction of wetlands is the Clean Water Act of 1972, right? And this basically establishes the basic structures for regulating and discharging of pollutants into waters. It needs to be drinkable, swimmable, and fishable, right? If you're familiar with that. But those are kind of they set the guidelines for water quality standards and what a wetland is, because there is a lot of confusion about, and there is some gray area about what is and isn't a wetland. So this was, the Clean Water Act was originally established in 1948. So a few years, 30 years-ish earlier. But it was kind of revamped and overhauled and structured differently, and it's vastly different now and is the 1972 Clean Water Act that everybody goes by. There have been various amendments to this. Specifically, one that's important is in 2008, which is the mitigation rule. So if you do destroy a wetland, then you have to offset that damage at a ratio, either 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. And that's dependent on what type of wetland you destroy. So if I'm trying to bulldoze through an emergent wetland, you guys learned what that was yesterday, with emergent vegetation coming out. If I'm bulldozing that, I have to replace it at a 2-to-1 ratio in acreage size. So if I destroyed a 1-acre wetland, I need to put down a 2-acre wetland somewhere else, right? And 3-to-1 if it's a forested or scrub wetland, right? So if I clear the forest, put my road through, I need to, again, replace that at a 3-to-1 ratio. So there has recently, as recent as last year, there is some controversial issues about the Clean Water Act, and the waters of the US have been redefined. And I'm not going to go into that because there's a whole lot there and a lot of different definitions. But what you should know is that some wetlands are now not protected and some wetlands specifically are. And so in our state's response to that, we used to not have any state laws that would protect wetlands, but we do have this West Virginia Water Pollution Control Act that now kicks in if it is not a jurisdictional federal protected wetlands. So now we have state protected wetlands versus federal protected wetlands. And the state protected wetlands would be more than the federal. So that is also another tool that we have. All right. So I'm going to get into a little bit about what I specifically do with this, because I work with the wetland monitoring and assessment side of things, which directly plays into the regulatory side of wetlands, right? And so what I do is, along with my colleague, we have created a new wetland functional assessment. So initially, right, you'd go out, you'd say, okay, this is a forested wetland, replace it at a 3-to-1 ratio. It doesn't matter what type of trees are there. It doesn't matter where it is on the landscape. It was a forested wetland, 3-to-1. What we have done is we've created a new assessment that's more inclusive of the physical, chemical, and biological side of wetlands to produce a score for a wetland. So we have a 0 to 1 index score for all wetlands in the state of West Virginia. All right, and if they are exemplary or above every other wetland in the state, which is about 2% of wetlands, then they have a score above 1. So I'll show you what I mean by that here in a second. So using this new assessment method that we've created, right, we've scored wetlands throughout the entire state. And so the median score, if you just right in the middle, is a 0.56, right? The median score, if you took all of the herbaceous wetlands, would be 0.47. So that would be your average emergent wetland. And if you took only the forested to scrub wetlands, it would be 0.68. So this is kind of in line with those ratios, right? What we're saying is that a 0.68, a forested wetland, has more function, has more biodiversity than an herbaceous or emergent wetland, right? So getting back to those ratios, if you remember, right, you replace an emergent wetland at 2-to-1 and a forested at 3-to-1. So we're kind of exactly along those lines, which is good to see. And then I mentioned there's this top bit that's above from a scale to 1 to 2. And these are going to be, actually, I say 2% here, but it's actually less than 2%. It's like 1.7% of all wetlands across the state are of special conservation concern. These are wetlands that if you destroyed, you're never going to be able to replace, either within the state or in the globe. You're never going to be able to find these wetlands ever again. All right, and so we have some very special ones which go into this 0 to 2 index. All right, and so what we've done is we've taken, if you remember, the National Wetlands Inventory of a map of every wetland across the state. So we've run our GIS tool, we've run this assessment method computerized tool across every mapped wetland in the state. And so now you at home or industry can now say, oh, look, I have a beautiful wetland right down the neighborhood. Let me go check that out. And it can help your county or your school or whatever it may be identify what are your more valuable wetlands in the community, as well as if you are an industry, right, and you're building a highway or a pipeline, a very linear project, you might go through a lot of various locations and you might avoid specific locations based off this to say, hey, there's actually a really good wetland over there. I don't want to go anywhere near that wetland because of backlash from the community, or it might cost me more money to replace that wetland. So we've kind of used this as an educational tool, but as well as a cost management tool as well. All right, and I'll show you how to get to this at the very end in case you're interested and want to check out what's nearby you, or if you have a wetland that you're interested in and want to go to it, you can maybe click and see how it ranks across the state. All right, so that's a bit about what I do. But I also we do these assessments based off of our regulatory peers, right, which are the Corps of Engineers. I know Tommy mentioned this yesterday, but to have a wetland, for regulatory purposes, right, there are a lot of different definitions, but we mainly use the Corps of Engineers version, which means you have to have all three of these, right? You're going to have hydrophytic plants, means water-loving plants, wetland soils, and wetland hydrology. And I'll go into that a little bit. I know Martin's going to cover a lot of this tomorrow. All right, so wetland-loving plants, all right, you have to be able to survive in soil, in water. These have a lot of various adaptive traits to them. I know Martin's getting into that. Every plant in the US has a ranking, and it will either be like an obligate, which means it loves water, a facultative wet, which means it mostly likes water. There's a facultative, which means it can be in wet or dry, and there's fac up, which means it normally likes upland, and then there's upland, which only likes upland. So there's every plant has a scale of how much they love water, basically. And so you have to be in the fac wet or higher, right? It has to like water to be a hydrophytic plant. All right, soils, Martin's going to go into this, but there are various characteristics of soil, like iron concentrations or iron along pores. Often soils for wetlands will have a gray-like color to them if they're mineral. If they're organic, it'll be a deep black. Yeah, and those are the two main soils. You'll have mineral and organic soils, but they can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. But there are certain characteristics that you're looking for in the soil that will qualify you as a wetland soil. And obviously, you have to have the hydrology, which means you have to have water at the surface. You don't have to see water, but at least near the surface for at least 2 weeks during the growing season, right? And there are various characteristics and measurements on where water, a minimum of water has to be, and that's why it can get a little confusing at times. And people might question, well, is this a wetland or is this not? But there are specific criteria. All right, so the next place I'm gonna kind of go on a little virtual tour of the state. So this is Charleston, West Virginia, place you or at least have seen some place similar to this. This is a disturbed cattail marsh. You see the monoculture of cattails throughout this. It's also located along a road, right? And this is something pretty common that you'll see. This is a disturbed wetland, but it is still functioning as a wetland. It might get a lower score on our wetland method, assessment method and stuff like that, but it is a still flood protection wetland. It is still functioning as habitat for places. So while this is not a wetland that personally I would like to see, it is still serving a purpose. It is not useless, if that makes any sense. All right, so that's a common one that you'll probably have seen or have seen along a road or something like that. The next place, this is Cranberry Glades, is a rice cut grass marsh. I put this in because, well, Cranberry Glades is is beautiful, and you should go if you haven't already been. But a rice cutgrass marsh is something that you can see in your backyard as well. So you can see it in this high pristine area, but it can also be found right in your backyard, in your backyard wetland, not in your backyard. What's so special about this particular species, you can kind of see in this picture on the right, is this hairy nodes, right? So if you're ever curious, do I have rice cutgrass? Well, does it have a lot of hair on the nodes? Another thing you might be able to notice from the stem here and the leaf is it's very serrated, right? So you don't want to be caught with shorts walking through this area, because it will grab at you. It is called cut grass for a reason. It'll be a little paper cut, and it will grab hold of you and it will take some skin. So don't get caught without some long pants if you're walking through this. One thing that we do with all the new people is we take a little piece of this carefully and we try and place it on the back of them, so because it'll just hang off of their back, and so we try and see how many pieces of rice cutgrass we can get on the backside of people who are new. Most I've ever got is 10, so if you get more than 10, good for you. You're stealthy. All right, another thing from this picture, which is also super common and something you might see in your backyard, it kind of looks a little fuzzy in this picture, and no, that's not because of just bad camera. This tall sedge is called wool grass. I know it says grass, but it is a sedge. It is something that's very common that you'll see. It is very woolly, like it's got a very small stem, that very strong small stem that will extend almost to head height, if not slightly lower. But if you're looking at it across the landscape here, it'll just appear very wool-like, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've seen that. Another place, this is Glade Run, so this is another pristine area, but is a burr-reed marsh, and burr-reed is actually super common as well. And so you can see this one in your backyard, even though it is also in super pristine areas. Burr-reed really likes water all the time. So this is typically found in a pond or in a place that's going to hold water extensively. It normally doesn't dry up all that often. As you can see here, there are beaver dams throughout wetlands as well, and that's what these big islands look like, and they enter in from the bottom, and there's their little home there. One of my favorite birds, which I was so fortunate to see this summer actually in a burr-reed marsh, was this American bittern. They're super elusive, and they take a lot of luck and a lot of time to look. But if you've got it and you're interested, I would highly recommend. This is a really cool bird to see. And I was actually able to see it this summer, so I was very happy. And not in this pristine Glade Run marsh. This was in Canaan Valley, so we were in a nice area, but we were by a subway. So don't limit yourself. Keep an eye out. If you see a burr-reed marsh, look very slowly, and he might appear. He might not. He likes to duck himself in between these marshes and sit very still. But one way, which is really unique, and he's got a very unique call. So if you're capable of listening or not in like a heavy high traffic area and can hear, the call is actually very cool. And yeah, this is the call. to me, that sounds like if I were to like play in my bath, right? And you like have a cup, anybody else, you like pull this down and like makes a little plopping noise, or if you throw a little pebble into water, it's like, boop. So that's what that reminds me of, and just keep an eye out for that one. Next one is a buttonbush swamp. So these pictures are actually not from West Virginia, but these are all over West Virginia, especially kind of close to the Ohio River. Sorry, blanked out for a second. But they are located everywhere throughout the state. And so this is one that you might run into if you live closer towards Charleston. Maybe you go out to Green Bottom. I think it's about a 30-minute drive from Charleston, but it's a nice wildlife management area, and they've got some really nice wetlands out there, and that's predominantly what you'll find in this area, as well as a large ponded area. But any shrub that you'll see, one of the most common shrubs is a buttonbush swamp, and it will have this characteristic flower bulb that is unlike any other in the state. All right, the next one is vernal pool. So does anybody, I remember I said I'd test you on your frogs. Does anybody remember what this frog is? If you said wood frog, then you are correct. All right, this is a wood frog. They lay their eggs in vernal pools, which are typically in forested areas, but they don't have to be. But these are areas that will hold water for extended periods, but they dry up at the end of the season. That is a characteristic of vernal pools. They're not there forever. They're there and filled by rainfall, but they'll sit there for a month or so, and they'll then dry up. So not incredibly long, not a lot of vegetation around these. They're typically in forested areas, like I said. But yeah, vernal pools. Very important as well, especially for amphibians. So if you're along the Ohio River, what are the common forested wetlands that we have? We've got silver maple wetlands and pin oak wetlands. So the first one here is silver maple. This one's incredibly common anywhere along the Ohio River, or if you're in the near the Potomac, very common there as well. These leaves are maple leaves, so they've got your classic maple leaf 5 hand like shape. But they, on the bottom, why they're called silver maples, because they've got a nice silver sheen to them. And they're also very good with for frogs, and for the American lotus is another common one, which is in the bottom right there, which are found in oxbows. So if you have any stream that has an oxbow in it and eventually gets cut off, those are depression areas where the American lotus will sit. Another one is this pin oak swamp, right? Which is, this one's from the Meadow River, but also you can find these along the Ohio. Home to a lot of various orchids, which you can see on the left, and home to the Diana fritillary, which comes up from the southern Appalachian hills and deposits larvae on these violets throughout the forest, and it's a very cool scene. I feel like I'm running out of time here. I got a lot to say. Another thing is pitch pine. This is super unique, right? You might think of a pine tree as being like an upland species, but this is actually on top of a mountain in Short Mountain. And so we've got pitch pine, cinnamon ferns with sundews and in the bottom left there, and then the Canadian burnet, which is the top left there, are some rare species that you might find here. Another one, these summit sinkhole wetlands, right? I mentioned that these are super specific to our wetlands, or for West Virginia, right? They're only found in the Ridge and Valley part of West Virginia, so that's in the eastern panhandle. These are what you would think of as sinkhole, right? Karst underneath, there's no outlet or inlet, or I mean, there's no inlet on top. The outlet is underneath through karst and is a great way that replenishes our aquifers and our groundwater. One of the rare species here kind of looks like woolgrass, but it's the northern bulrush here. We've got marl fens, which are in Jefferson County. Something super unique about this wetland, right, is the soil. It kind of looks like rocky road, right? So there's this Coricium terrestrial snail in the top right that has been documented over thousands and thousands of years. It's still there today. You can find these snails, but if you keep digging, you'll find these tiny shells throughout, which look like rocky road. And so this snail specifically has been documented there for thousands and thousands of years just by examining the soil. It's really cool. I'm gonna skip this one for the sake of time. The last one I'll go into is a frost pocket, which if you're up near Morgantown, you might have visited Cranesville Swamp. Cranesville Swamp is a frost pocket, and what I mean by a frost pocket is that when the cold air drains and comes off of the sides of these mountains, it falls on the landscape, and it falls into a pocket of the land. And this pocket of land happens to be a wetland of Cranesville Swamp. And because there's this pocket, it now has frost later in spring and earlier in the fall, which means there's a shorter growing season for a lot of plants that live there, which has specifically made that wetland super unique because of this shorter growing season, and it limits some other vegetation that might have come in and grown rapidly. But so this area specifically is unique because it has this shorter period, but it, excuse me, it also has everything else. So it's got a high level of a diversity, but it's also got some species that you would find in Canada because of this short growing season. All right, and this is what Cranesville Swamp looks like. You're right, you can kind of see how the landscape kind of bowls into this one little area. One thing about this picture that I would like to say is this is a wetland complex, right? We might say forested wetland, an emergent wetland, a bog, a fen, right? Wetland complexes are all of those combined. You might see a forested section here in the middle. You might see a sphagnum bog over here. You've got an emergent section over here. You've got a shrub scrub wetland over. It's all connected. It's all one wetland. And so it can be kind of confusing to define specific areas. But this is all one wetland complex. And what makes it so special is this mosaic of everything pieced together. All right, another place like that is Canaan Valley, where you have these tussock fens, but then you also have the forest right next to it of a balsam fir. They have introduced the fisher, and they've even found some rare crayfish, the blue crayfish, in these specialized areas. So really unique, really diverse systems. Right next door is Dolly Sods, with your sphagnum, heath peatlands. Heath means your cranberries, blueberries, raisins, huckleberry, like all chokeberry, any kind of berry like that. So these fields are full of berries, as well as sphagnum, which you can see in the top right. This sphagnum forms peat and really compacts on itself and forms a large sponge. When it rains, it just soaks up and expands. All right, and the last one that I'm going to mention here is Otter Creek Wilderness. This is one that I was talking to earlier. The cotton grass fin, I love the cotton grass fin, particularly because of what you can see in this picture, right? It's just fields of white that really seem to come out of nowhere. Excuse me. And there are sphagnum bogs as well. So I really love this landscape and some of the diversity that you can find here. The pink grass in the top right, specialized sundew in the middle, and the narrow leaf genation, which is pretty common, so you would be able to see that one. The other two are pretty rare. All right, I won't go into these, but I will say this as kind of some final remarks. Wetlands are wonderful, and I hope you agree. I've walked through a lot of vegetation in this presentation, but one thing that my colleague has made is this common wetlands plant guide. And so it'll have a lot of common wetland plants in it and things that you would see in your neighborhood or in your backyard, or even if you were to visit Dolly Sods or Cranberry Glades or someplace unique, it will have specific vegetation for that area as well. And so we currently are trying to get more printed, like in hard copy. But if you would like a PDF version, either for your phone or maybe have a iPad or something like that you take with you, this is a good resource that you can download for free off our website here. All right. This is, I promise I'm almost done. This is another useful tool, like I was telling you about how we've mapped and scored all of these wetlands. This is the West Virginia DEP GIS viewer and how you view all of that data. So it will have more than what we've pushed out. There are streams, there are wetlands, there are mines. If you're interested in a specific area, you can find data on that, especially for what we're doing. If you're interested in your neighborhood, type in the West Virginia DEP GIS viewer, and you can see what might be in your neighborhood or what you might be interested in. All right, and that's all I'm going to say. If you have to report anything, if you're interested in something like that, there is a link to the Corps of Engineers. Remember, they are the governing body for wetlands, especially for federal wetlands. And if you notice anything, this is how you would report. There's a link there. That's my presentation. I know I went a little over, but thank you. If you have any questions, I'm capable of talking. If you want to leave, I understand.
Thank you.
Could you do questions through the audio?
Yes.
Jack, this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I learned a lot. I was wondering, you showed a slide where it spoke to the oxygen content of wetland soil as being lower, and I missed some of the other attributes, but could you tell me what are some of the salient features of wetland soil when drained that make it so agriculturally productive?
Yeah, so the way the plants break down excuse me, the way specific plants break down nutrients in these wetlands leaves a lot of nitrogen-rich soils. And so that specifically is like a fertilizer in a way, and especially peat soils. Peat soils are organic materials, so it's just years and years of organic material that is just what you would use in fertilizer anyway. So
Thank you.
that's why. I don't know why I can't view the chat.
Thank you, Jack. This was wonderful.
Yeah, sorry, it took a little bit more time than allotted.
Thank you again, Jack. And we got you started a little bit late, so you were absolutely fine.
Okay.
Would you be able to send us those some of those hyperlinks, like for the the field guide and things like that?
Yes, I can send you this entire presentation and specifically those links as well.
Fantastic. And somebody had asked in the chat about the West Virginia Botanic Garden and the status of those wetlands.
Yes, that is on there. On our, if you go to this this viewer, this GIS viewer, West Virginia DEP, just type that in Google search bar. It'll pop up. This map will take you there. If you type in, there's a specific place that you can type in West Virginia Botanic Garden, or if you have an address for that, you can zoom right to it. Yes, we have done assessments at that specific garden, so I know that it's on there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Could someone tell me what tomorrow's speaker is going to hone in on?
Yeah, he's going to talk about soils and specifically chemistry on wetlands. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
That's correct. This is Martin from tomorrow, and that's correct. It may be a little heavy on chemistry, but hopefully we can have fun with it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking to us from the future.
Very quickly, I had a question about the West Virginia Water Control Act. Does that not cover the filling in of our streams from mountaintop removal and things like that? The acid mine drainage? Just seems like we still have so much bad stuff in our water.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this doesn't specifically say you can't do something. It basically says how much you're going to have to pay if you want to do something. And so unless there is like an endangered species or something in there which says specifically no, you cannot go in this location, then if you have the money and are willing, then there's a good chance that you can do it. There are specific locations, which is why we're trying to push our tool a lot, and where we actually hope to have this adopted by the Corps of Engineers next month. I can say that. That's the plan, is to have our tool adopted. And so anything that gets above a 1 really hits home in avoidance. They stress avoidance of areas. And so if you have a high enough score, we would hope that you would avoid those. And if not, then it really hits your wallet if that's the case. But yeah,
And
unfortunately
are those fines earmarked then for reparation or?
Yeah, so any money that comes of that goes into 2 options. You have the option to pay in lieu fee, which is the state. It's our state's restoration monitoring. So they do stream work and they do wetland work. So if you were to destroy that, there are specific criteria that you have to put back, and that will either be done by the state, or there are specific companies that have already invested in creating new wetlands, knowing that somebody will destroy some somewhere and pay them for that that credit. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It is not an ideal system, especially for those who love wetlands.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have any questions for Jack? Because if not, we're going to go ahead and close this out. Anybody else? I'll take that as a no. Well, thank you again, Jack. That was wonderful. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad I could do this.
It was great. I enjoyed getting the whole deck, if
Yeah.
possible.
Thank
Go
you.
back through it again.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Michelle, I forget, is this being recorded so an Ollie member could catch it later?
Yes, this is recorded. And as a matter of fact, yesterday's is done. That's thanks to Mike Atfield, who started taking over the video processing for us. So I'll be sending out an email in a little bit with yesterday's link. And then as soon as today's is done, we'll send that out as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Thanks.